Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming to this panel on trust in American society. I want to just talk about what motivated this panel in particular. Arguably, trust has been one of America's best superpowers, historically speaking. Trust is related to a variety of different outcomes. It relates to greater health, greater happiness, greater life satisfaction. It's also related to economic prosperity, to better functioning democratic institutions, and also trust is related to resilience in the face of crisis. It's really the glue that keeps us together. But what we know is that trust has been in rapid decline. In the 1970s, there was about a third of people, it was about a half of Americans thought that other people can be trusted. And today that's down to about a third. Also alarmingly, only about 17% of people trust our government to do the right thing. And when we lose faith in other people, we start questioning, we start losing confidence in a variety of institutions, from the news, the courts, our communities, and even our leaders. And so today we want to try to understand the multiple dimensions of this trust crisis, and even more importantly, what we can do about it. I am so honored to be on this really dream team panel with my colleagues and friends, and I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Larry Diamond, over here on my left, is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in the Global Democracy Program at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, or FSI. He also chairs the Hoover Institution Project in Taiwan and Indo-Pacific region, and is the principal investigator of the Global Digital Policy Incubator. Next to Larry is our beloved Margaret Levi, who's an award-winning political scientist. She was the president of the American Political Association. She was also the director of the Center for Advanced Study here at Stanford, of CASBIS. And she's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of the British Academy, and of the American Philosophical Society. She focuses on what makes for trustworthy governance in states and organizations, and what evokes citizen compliance or dissent. What I'm going to do is, in terms of the structure of this panel, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions to the panelists, and then I will open it up for questions. We have someone that will run around with a mic so that we can have you.
You might want to introduce Tom.
Oh my gosh, did I not? Oh my God. Tom, you are not chopped liver. Oh my God. My beloved friend, Tom Freeman. Needs no introduction, right?
He's just so well
He really needs no introduction. He's an internationally acclaimed author, reporter, and columnist for the New York Times since 1981, and the author of 7 best-selling books, including Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations. And he writes a regular column about U.S. foreign policy, domestic politics, the environment, economics, and energy. So thank you. That was very important also introduction.
Can I make one request?
Yes.
Can they turn this clock on? You just tell us when it's 5 minutes, because it's got the seconds ticking off.
Yeah, it's a little
extremely annoying.
Yeah, maybe we could turn off this.
We'll you just tell us when we're almost done.
Yeah, we could put maybe a tablecloth on top of it. So I want to start with Tom. You've argued that Americans can no longer agree on the basic facts, and that this is not by accident. So we want to hear, what are some of the forces that have been challenging or shattering that shared sense of truth? And why has it been so hard to put it back together? And that's a broad question, yeah. So I know you have a lot to say about this. So I'll begin with Tom.
Well, thanks, Michele. It's great to be here and with this great panel and to be at Stanford. The way I've been writing about it, Michele, is because I use nature a lot as both a model and a mentor for my own thinking. People ask me, how I'm feeling today. I say, well, the worst thing that happened, I think, in my career as a journalist is that as a country, we lost our mangroves. I didn't know much about mangroves. I grew up in Minnesota. But in the mid-1990s, I took a trip to the Atlantic rainforest with Conservation International, and I got introduced to mangroves. And mangroves, these trees that grow right on the edge of oceans and land, do 4 amazing things in nature. They filter toxins and pollutants. They buffer storms. They create nurseries for young fish to grow because they have very cabled roots and large predator fish can't get in. And they hold the shore in place because their roots are actually interwoven and they also have aerial roots, so they're very, very stable. And the worst thing that happened in my career, I believe, is that we lost our mangroves, but not just in nature. It used to be that if you had unprotected sex with a stripper, a month after your wife gave birth to your son, you wouldn't be running for president. Shame was a mangrove. And the mangrove of shame has really been lost. That we live in this incredible age of impunity. Elite responsibility was a mangrove. It used to be that if you got named to the august position of being a justice on the Supreme Court, your wife wouldn't be conspiring with the chief of staff of the president in order to extend his presidency or flying the American flag upside down. Civility was a mangrove. When I was working on this essay during COVID, I watched a lot of old movies. And one of them was Inherit the Wind. And there's this amazing scene in there where Henry Drummond comes into the courtroom, and for the first time, it was the first trial, the Scopes Monkey trial, that was broadcast live on radio. And he walked into the courtroom and said, "God, radio." And the broadcaster said, "You can't say God on the radio." We just had a president who said, "Fuck." Okay. A complete loss of just decency and civility. And in my business, small town newspapers were a mangrove. President Obama tells this story that when he was running for president, he started his campaign in Southern Illinois, and went down to Southern Illinois and would go to a small town, meet with the newspaper editor, usually conservative, usually a white guy. And Obama would spend an hour with him, and at the end of the hour, editor would say, "You know what? I'm going to endorse the black guy. I'm going to endorse the black guy. Black guy's okay." Well, today that editor's gone, that newspaper's gone, that mangrove is gone, and now it goes directly unfiltered from Fox or MSNBC into your living room. And so I believe these filtering institutions, Larry was just telling me how Madison and the Federalist Papers talked about the importance of filtration. They've been completely uprooted. And we need to figure out how to restore our mangroves. You can rebuild a damaged mangrove in nature, but you have to be very intentional about it. And mangroves, by the way, mangrove forest always has a diversity of species. And the only way to restore them is to restore the diversity of species, and you need a neighborhood that's got its act together around there to sustain it. So for me, it's an interesting and important metaphor for what we're doing.
Wow, that is an incredible metaphor. Just a follow-up question, and then Margaret, I'm going to build on that with you. When do you think this started? Was there a period or a moment that you woke up in Washington, D.C. and said, well, I won't curse, but said that you started to realize there's a real serious erosion of mangroves, of the societal mangroves? Is there any particular time that you thought, wow, this is getting to be nonlinear?
Yeah, I mean, I think I date everything to 2007, which is when Facebook was born. And I really think social media so disintermediated us from each other. There's literally nothing in the world worse than being able to be anonymous on social media.
Yeah.
Say what you will about the Chinese, but if you want to be on Sina Weibo, you've got to be there with your name.
Yeah.
And when you grant people anonymity and then allow them to say anything you want without an editor intervening in any way, and we fell into this insane trap of conflating editing of any kind with censorship, that I think that was a real moment. I know Jonathan Haidt in his work also describes the moment of social media as really a moment of decline. My teacher and friend Dov Seidman likes to say that trust is the only legal performance enhancing drug. It's the only legal performance enhancing drug. When trust is in the room, good things happen.
Yeah.
And when trust is not in there, it's like a hard floor. Even a short guy like me could maybe jump off a hard floor, and I can't dunk a basketball, but maybe get near the net. Without trust, it's like you're living in the Syrian desert. You can't jump a millimeter. There's nothing to pivot off.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got all these social media is just a giant trust destroying engine. You can destroy people's reputation from afar, you can lie from afar, and there's zero accountability. So I've actually, in my life, people know this at the New York Times, I've actually never looked at Twitter, I've never looked at Facebook, I've never looked at Instagram, I've never looked at TikTok, and I've never smoked a cigarette. And my plan is to die saying all five. So if you're tweeting about me out there, y'all have a good time. I'm not there.
You know, I think it's really interesting because really what you're describing is a loosening of norms, and there's a latitude that's just unheard of. From your first example of cursing on the radio to your example of social media, when you have anonymity or when you have that lack of accountability, it really does start to cycle in terms of what are people really accountable for. You know, Margaret, I wanted to ask you, and we're talking about the crisis of truth. We lost our shared facts, we've lost our accountability. I know your lifelong work, you've been thinking about this from a different perspective, almost even perhaps the reverse question, which is the issue of whether institutions have been trustworthy enough to gain our trust, to deserve our trust. So I wanted to ask you what you think makes institutions worthy of trust, and are they falling short today, and why? It's a big question, but I think there's different angles on this that we're trying to explore here that will be relevant for the kind of solutions that we propose.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I have to respond a little
The
bit.
cigarette question, or what?
No, I don't smoke cigarettes. I have smoked some illegally.
I haven't done that.
But I do think and we'll get back to this, but the erosion of the social infrastructure, I actually think predates social media. And if we don't understand that and the kinds of things that happened during the Vietnam War, that happened with the decline of labor unions, PTAs, a lot of different things.
Bowling alone.
And more than bowling alone, but that the social media, clearly aggravated that, and accelerated that. But I wouldn't say that was the start. And part of my answer to how we restore trust is going to come back to some of the social infrastructure. There's another point I want to make before really delving into the institutions and how they gain trust, which is that we're overemphasizing, distrust isn't always a bad thing.
Could be rational.
Particularly when we're talking about government, but even sometimes when we're talking about other people. I wrote an article once called "Defenses Make Good Neighbors." I mean, distrust makes good defenses. Distrust makes good defenses.
I understand.
So that's one of the things that we were raised at in the American democracy is that skepticism can be healthy, that we shouldn't always trust our government. And I think we're at a moment where looking at the extent of distrust of government may be a good reflection of how people really feel about the government that we should pay attention to. And it's not necessarily a negative sign in and of itself. That being said, most of my work, as you said, has really been on how we think about creating trustworthy governments and organizational leadership that will evoke consent and compliance rather than dissent and rebellion, right? And where we get people to actually obey the law and do other things. And there are a couple of elements that are critical to that. One is that the government, the people who run the government, actually, particularly those who are elected by us, more or less keep their promises. Now, there are all kinds of situations in which they get more information and they may not be able to keep a particular promise. But they then have it incumbent upon them to communicate those reasons and to make that clear to us. But promise keeping also requires delivery of what you've promised, and that has to be done in a way that's both competent and that also meets whatever the standards of fairness are in that particular place and time. That there's some kind of due process, that everyone's getting some of that benefit or appropriately getting the benefits that they should get. Another crucial piece of it is that we feel confident that those who are free riding and those who aren't obeying the law are actually going to get punished. Something else that's being violated at the current moment in a big way, I'd say. So it's not so much that you've got to get Tom to obey the rules. It's that you've got to make sure that when Larry breaks them, he goes to jail and stays there at least long enough to serve his term.
They're best friends, I just want to.
He does not break rules. And I think the final thing I want to emphasize is that part of what is involved in having trust in government, or feeling that the government is trustworthy, which is, I think, a better way to state it, is that we actually believe that it's operating in the common good, that its commitments are to the common good. And that crosses partisan boundaries. I mean, there are a number of candidates who I might not have voted for, but I certainly believed that their interest was in the welfare of the United States and its citizens. And that's something else that I think undermines trust in government and trust among ourselves right now.
So, Margaret, I just want to ask you, do you have an example of an institution, because you've talked about trustworthy institutions beyond just the government, that you think is getting this right? Right now, it feels like the post office is kind of high up on that list.
Well, not anymore.
Not, I guess maybe that's all.
Used to be.
So, do you have any examples? It could be even in the U.S. or elsewhere, because we're going to actually segue to Larry. We're going to get into the global context of trust. But I'm just curious: is there any particular institution that you think is reliable, is benevolent, is following through on its promises, or is it widespread, this decline in trustworthy institutions?
I'm a comparativist.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think in the United States right now, given the current government, it's undermined almost all of our institutions. I mean, we have very little confidence in the rule of law. We have very little confidence in the post office. You know, this thing about how are the votes going to be delivered on time if we do have the mail ballot continuing. But if you think about other countries, I mean, I've just been reading a lot, once again, about Denmark, which has been producing a number of institutional arrangements around the environment, around a number of other things that have led to and social welfare for its citizens that create a lot of trustworthy government and trust in the government.
Yeah. So there could be some lessons learned.
There are lots of examples internationally. There are not. I mean, we're seeing an undermining of trustworthy institutions almost every one of them in the United States.
Yeah.
Right now.
Well, let me actually pick up on that with you, Larry. You've been studying the world for years, studying democracies that falter, democracies that survive. And one of the early warning signs in the collapse of democracies is the collapse of public trust in institutions. And I'm wondering, as you look at the data on trust in the U.S., whether it's in the courts or it's in communities or in the government, what does it tell you based on patterns you've seen in the world? Are we in a danger zone? Are we catastrophizing here? How would you place our democratic resilience compared to what you've seen around the world?
Well, I think there are a variety of reasons. Is this on?
Yeah.
Good. I think there are a variety of reasons why we should be worried, okay? And declining trust is intimately related to them, but it's not the only one. But first, I want to echo two things that Margaret said. I think it's very important to underscore them. I actually went back over the long time period, which you were doing as well, I think, in Michele, preparing for this. And, you know, back in the Eisenhower days, you know what trust in government, it was like 75%. Maybe that's too much trust, right? And we were blindly trusting. And then we know what happened. It was Vietnam, it was Watergate, it was the multiple hits, it was the Iranian hostages, it was Carter's poor performance. And by the time Reagan came along, and it was morning in America, and well, until the Iran-Contra affair, you know, he actually never hit higher than about 43% in terms of trust in government to do the right thing. So I didn't think it was working. So
You have a good voice.
there was, you know, there was a fundamental change at that point. But I think Margaret is profoundly right in saying that, and I would refer everyone back to a very famous quote from the late Hoover Institution liberal democratic philosopher Sidney Hook, that what democracy requires is not blind faith in government, but also not reflexive rejecting of government either. He actually used the word skeptical.
Yep.
It's an orientation that toward government that is scrutinizing, skeptical, not blindly dismissive, and I think he used the word not hostilely rejecting, but somewhere in between. Now, here's something that I found that's very interesting, and then I'll come to the international dimension. I was mentioning this to Margaret. I was stunned by it and shocked by it when I saw it last night. If you look at the Gallup public opinion poll trends on trust in institutions, which, Margaret, you say they're the same categories as the National Election Survey, the Gallup categories are if you have a great deal of trust or quite a lot of trust, that counts as trust. And if you say you have some trust or very little trust, they count that as distrust. In a lot of other surveys in the world, they count some trust as trust. The response categories are different. And you know, maybe some trust is enough trust in the context of what you're saying. So in that sense, our situation in the US, depending on the type of survey you're looking at, may not be as despairing as it's sometimes presented. But I will say one other thing, comparing with our Democratic peers, when you use the same metric for data last year in terms of trust in government, Margaret, I know, will appreciate this. The European systems that have parliamentary rule, proportional representation, kind of inclusive representation, coalition government, they might look messy and slow, but they actually have significantly higher trust in government, not only Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, but also Germany.
Yeah.
And, you know, then say the first past the post more majoritarian systems of Canada and Australia, which are at about the 50% range. And then the US is way down there at 31%. So something else is going on.
They're also the social democratic systems.
Yes, that's right. They kind of go together. And then if you really want to know how bad it can be, have a look at Latin America, where trust in institutions has been extremely low for a long time. You know what trust in the parliament is in Brazil now? It's like, I don't know, 10% or something. And the average trust in Congress in Latin America, it's a little higher than in the US. But it's only when you look at institutions that are essentially non-political, the church, the police, and the military, that you start getting in Latin America middling or higher trust in institutions. And that's true in the US as well. I also looked at the African data. And again, it's when you get at non-political institutions, the military, and in Africa, very interestingly, traditional rulers who are separated from politics. Like even in several African countries or the continent on average, trust in local government isn't very high because they see local government as well stealing their money. But when you're looking at a different metric like traditional rulers, it's very different. So the consequence is this. If you have chronic distrust as a result of chronic corruption and bad performance and failure to deliver, people get dissatisfied with democracy. And dissatisfaction with democracy in South Africa, for example, well, let's put it this way, satisfaction with the way democracy is working in South Africa has fallen from like 60% under Mandela to 50% with his successor, and it's now at 29%. That's a democracy, in my opinion, the most important on the African continent that's in really serious trouble. And I'll just conclude by saying, what do you get when you have declining trust across the board in institutions, declining satisfaction with the way democracy is working. You get people who want strong men who have the answer and can shortcut the institutions and claim to be above all the political muck. We know what we got in the United States. In South Africa, the danger comes from the kind of intolerant left in the form of a radical leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters Party called Julius Malema. And if Ramaphosa and the Democratic Alliance that he's gone into coalition with can't produce more inclusive economic growth and less corruption, that democracy is not going to survive.
Wow, I think it's really interesting you pointed out this curvilinear pattern, right? It's too much and too little trust actually be problematic. I think economists have also shown that. I'm wondering where you see as the canary in the coal mine, as another metaphor, of what the warning signs are in any of the countries you've been studying. And also, why do we think this is happening? Tom, you've talked a lot about accelerations. The world is so much more complex than it was in the 1970s and 1960s on so many different dimensions. Your argument about Facebook is it also that people see they're making social comparisons around the world. They're seeing more that their institutions are failing them. At the same time, the institutions are dealing with so much more complexity. How do we connect the dots among the different sources that you're talking about? So I guess I'll just let Larry respond since I asked you the original, and then we'll go to anyone else in the panel.
So I think what Margaret was talking about is very true. You have to have a broad spectrum at any point in time in terms of institutional and social dynamics, and you also have to have a long historical span. But I'd say a couple of other things. Number one, to kind of footstomp what Tom was saying, I think that social media are delivering a uniquely toxic and polarizing environment in terms of information flows, because it is ingrained in their business model. It is how they think they can maximize revenue. It drives their algorithms, which are driving what we see and what information circles or spheres we live in. And so it's overwhelming our mangroves to remove the toxins in our political and informational space. Secondly, related to what Tom was saying about local media, I think the disappearance of local media at the state and local level is like a really significant development. And again, just stumbling on the internet last night, I didn't save everything for last night, but I thought I'd give it one more try. And it turns out Reid Hoffman announced yesterday the winner of his $9 million challenge for who would get the grant to try and restore trust in our institutions. And the winner is basically a state level online, but hopefully to service local newspapers and institutions, information network called Cal Matters to report on state government. Wow. And to look at all the votes in the state legislature, all the decisions of state government, put them online, track them, and make government at the California level more accessible and more transparent. And I think we're in a paradox in another way. One of the reasons we're in a challenging environment now is because there's so much information coming about corruption, self-dealing, sexual misconduct, and so on and so forth. And it makes people cynical. But if you actually have large-scale systematic reporting, you'll also get good news about what's happening. And people will have enough news to put it in context and bring it back to the healthy midpoint that Margaret's talking about. I really urge people to look at the announcement from Reid Hoffman's initiative. It's really kind of an uplifting and hopeful development. Mm-hmm.
I mean, Tom, I'll ask you to riff on that also. I mean, at one point you're saying that social media and information can be really good. It can help us to keep institutions accountable, in Margaret, your language, trustworthy, but it also could be just a sewer of polarization. So how do you make sense of that? And also the sort of acceleration point. I mean, you've written about different sources of acceleration and complexity. How much is that a big part of this problem of institutions not being able to catch up that level of complexity, and also it eroding social norms?
Yeah, on the media, we kind of went in our lifetime from too little information to too much information.
Yeah.
And now the challenge is really what to believe. Really, you need courses now in digital civics of how to read the internet. When the internet first appeared, people literally would say, if they said something outlandish, they'd say, well, but I read it on the internet, as if that settled the bar bet, because it was cast in a patina of technology and modernity that now people obviously have gotten much wiser than that. But I think literally teaching people how to read, how to triangulate, how to check whether something is true or not needs to be part of the basic education from a very early age. People ask me what I do for a living. I tell them I'm a translator from English to English. I take really complicated subjects that I don't understand, and I have great tutors, people like Larry and others, and they break it down so I can understand it, and then I can translate it into for other people. Because excuse me, I live by Marie Curie's motto that now is the time to understand more, so we will fear less. Because we live in an age where it has become a giant industry to make people stupid and angry. It's just a vast industry now, and so I think that I find that as noble a calling of making things explicable for people as investigative journalism, exposing corruption, because if people don't understand, they fall prey to what Marco, autocrats and whatnot, and this is such a dizzyingly complex moment that I think you can't do enough of that.
Yeah. I want to get to solutions before.
Well, I have a different perspective.
Yeah, please. Actually, Margaret, go ahead. What's your
So I think the social media is important. I think information is important. I don't want to diss that at all. But I think we're not paying enough attention to the way in which democracy's institutions need repair. That they are 250 years old. They haven't evolved sufficiently. One of the projects you're involved in is new forms of deliberation and engagement. I mean, we really have to think about the ways in which people's voices are heard, are respected, are responded to. And we're doing a very inadequate job of that as democracies, most democracies. And I think that's part of the problem. We also have lost, and this is related to the earlier discussion, many of the intermediate organizations, of which the local newspapers are but one, that would help do what you do as an opinion writer, translate, say to people that you can't behave like that in this situation. This is our norms for this, whether it be traditional religious institutions or unions or
VFW,
a whole bunch of organizations like
post
that.
office?
So the post office, right. So I think we need to really think about, we came to the end of neoliberalism and there wasn't really an alternative elaborated. Capitalism has gone through multiple transformations since the time of Adam Smith, and we're sort of stuck at the moment with an old form of capitalist democracy and capitalism. So, I think the institutions themselves need a refresh and a rethink, and that's more than the social media or information problem, or certainly they don't help, but it's more than that.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's both is really what the biggest problem is, right? It's the accountability of the institutions, but it's also the information ecosystem that's intersecting with that. I do want to
say one thing. I want to pick up on Margaret's mind because I sent my friend Michael Sandel a note this morning.
Yeah.
Because Michael wrote a book on things that money can't buy.
Right.
And so I was home last night in Washington, D.C., where I live. And before I went to bed, I looked at ESPN and I saw that the Hornets and the Miami Heat were tied 114 at the end of their playoff game. So I said to my wife Ann, I said, honey, let's just go. They're tied, it's overtime, so let's go watch, the overtime. So I went to my TV and I put on the sports channel, that shows all the different games, and no game was on. And then I went to the guide and no game was on. So I went to Google and said, Miami Heat, Hornets game, and it said it's streaming on Amazon. So what was a public good before? You could just turn on your TV. Right. You now had to actually subscribe to Amazon Prime in order to see something that was actually thought of in the past as a kind of a collective thing. We all sat around our TV, we watched the World Series, and the same thing happened with the NCAA women's finals. I was in New Zealand and I wanted to watch the NCAA women's finals, and it was streaming on Paramount. Yeah.
It is.
And these are fracturing.
These are many options, and we used to watch the same channel, the same people together.
It's the skyboxification of just from a different perspective.
Yeah, I want to ask you, before we start talking about solutions, we've been talking about this in the abstract, but we know that context really matters. And actually we were talking about that when we had a call a couple weeks ago, that this collapse might not be playing out the same way for everyone. There are certain communities that are where decline is much steeper, different institutions where there's also problems. Larry, you mentioned Latin America as a good example. Like, there's some institutions that are really distrusted, but there's a few that are not. Other communities that are really suffering in terms of how trustworthy they see institutions, or whether they're more affected by the information ecosystem. So any thoughts from the panel on how context is playing out in terms of trust and trustworthiness?
It is. Well, and this is the mangrove example, really. That you can change the context in a way that you undermine the ways in which the interconnections exist that make it a healthy situation. And we're seeing that in multiple communities that are really different from each other, that are in the United States. We'll just take the United States. So, Southern white men feel highly dissed and disrespected. Black Americans are complaining appropriately that they have not gotten all that was promised to them, that the inequality still remains. There are religious groups who feel that they're not understood any longer or respected anymore. So I think it's playing out there are fractures in multiple places, and that leads to distrust of government and each other across those boundaries generally. But it also leads to distrust of different kinds of institutions by those different groups. Yeah. So it's not a universal thing. There is a context there, an environment in which things are growing or not growing.
Yeah. And that mangrove destruction seems like it's more or less severe depending on the context.
And the poisonous plants are taking over.
Yeah. Larry.
So I think we must go to work on the polarization problem. And we're not going to change the social media context, unfortunately, I think, radically and soon in terms of being a driver of that. But I think there are important things we can do, and important shocks or moments that we can exploit in the best sense of the word. And now I want to say to my dear friend, Tom Friedman, I don't think I've put it to you quite this way. My favorite Tom Friedman column of all time was your foreign reporting recently from Minneapolis about how trust emerged in Minneapolis.
Yeah, that's a great story.
And before I get to the electoral institutional reforms that I think could help pull us out of this mess, I think you should say something about that, because I think in the seed of that is part of the hope for the future, and very much speaking to the social roots of organization and connectedness that Margaret also has in mind.
That emerged, right?
Yeah, it was I'm from Minneapolis, so I had a little advantage, appreciating it. It was an emergent event. None of them saw it coming. Yeah. But if you're from Minnesota, it was totally natural, because don't come for winter people in winter. That's just a general. And we are winter people, and winter people Minnesota is partly the way it is because your car is stuck in the snow, and I dig you out on Wednesday, and then Michele digs me out on Friday. You know, it just brings people together. But it surprised people there too, like, you know, and it because it was not only emergent, but this is sort of a silly thing. I still, for old time's sake, belong to a golf club in Minneapolis, Interlochen Golf Club. You know, very, very a Republican conservative club. Man, they defended their Hispanic employees just like everybody else. It was, if you're from Minnesota, it was a very natural thing. And I've been thinking about, and I wanted to ask actually this question to you, Larry, you know, Minnesota and Hungary, you know, really, really interesting, you know. And this wasn't just like 51-49. It was slam dunk. You know, take that shit somewhere else, you know, and we aren't putting up with it. And it makes me a little hopeful for 2026, but I think that it shows that I've never bought into the affordability argument that Democrats should just run on affordability. How about we run on democracy?
Yeah.
It may actually, in community, you know, it may actually be the winning ticket.
But the other piece of Minneapolis and of Hungary is that there were organizations built on the ground that already pre-existed, whether it be the golf clubs or whether there was a child care association that was pre-existing what happened when ICE came in. And those people mobilized for each other. So there was this, and the same thing was happening in Hungary. There was really on the ground pre-mobilization. And I think we can't forget, and that is part of democracy. It's really getting people to participate and engage in a variety of ways. So when the moments of stress come, you actually have a capacity to respond. You can't just, it seldom just comes up from the ground, or it can't be sustained that way. And what was remarkable about Minneapolis was how they played by a certain set of rules that kept them above, you know, you couldn't criticize them really. I mean, they acted legally. They were nonviolent. They were articulate. I mean, it was really well done.
But Mark, you're very right about this. One of the things I discovered, which is that they actually studied what happened in Chicago, what happened in Portland. So the sort of social entrepreneurs were there ready to get it started. But then, like so many people, my friends who had a restaurant, everyone was in a WhatsApp group, and then just suddenly it just mushroomed and proliferated.
Absolutely.
You know?
So the roots were there, right? I think the Hungary example is similar, that there was a sense that this took a long time, but then suddenly there was this nonlinear dynamic. So the roots were there, whether it was in civic associations. I'm wondering, Larry, you've done a lot of work on deliberative democracy in American One Room. I'd imagine that was having people from all over the country in one room to try to help create these civic types of norms. Is there some model that you think could be scalable in local communities to help really kind of accelerate what happened in Minnesota in different communities?
And tie in the Hungary thing too, Larry. I'm very interested in your take on what happened in Hungary and whether this is now a trend we're seeing.
Okay, I'll just start with Hungary by saying I think it's the most significant gain. Well, it's one of two or three of the most significant gains for democracy, maybe since this whole awful democratic recession started around the time Viktor Orban came back to power in 2010. I just can't overstate the significance of it. And it was a tremendous coming together of people, you know, at the grassroots. It took leadership of a very different nature as well. It took the European Union cutting the financial support for Orban. But I think you're going to see it iterate now throughout Europe, and the populism of this kind and maybe beyond. Let's not ignore the ties that radiate all the way back to the United States to be on the run. So I think there's all sorts of lessons here. I might note that Magyar didn't only talk about democracy. Actually, he didn't talk that much about it.
Yeah.
He talked about corruption.
Yeah.
And he linked it to the miserable state of social services and the economy.
So there was an affordability issue there.
Well, in a certain way.
Also a fairness.
In a certain way.
Interesting. That's a better
That's
better way.
So 2 more points quickly. One is, when you look at a lot of the comparative data, and here I really want to underscore sub-Saharan Africa again, a lot of cynicism about political institutions, parties, parliaments, politicians, and so on. You know what they have much more trust in? NGOs. Grassroots organizations of a kind of Tocquevillian nature, if I may use it that way, where people have come together to cooperate for a common purpose. Now, with our deliberative democracy and our deliberative polling, but the real payoff is if we can enlarge deliberative polling to be beyond just drawing random samples and get large numbers of Americans deliberating together under what my colleague Jim Fishkin calls good conditions. And what are good conditions? Good conditions are, you have some structure to it. You don't just throw people together in a room. By the way, I'm very sorry to all of you who's where I've had my back turned this time. I feel kind of guilty, but this is the way I'm positioned.
Are they at the same seminar we are?
Huh? You know,
We're looking at them.
in any case, one of the good conditions is objective information, right? And another good condition is having fairly stated pro and con arguments. And the third condition is an ethic, which is clearly established, whether it's a deliberative poll or a school deliberation or something like that, of mutual respect. And, you know, everybody gets equal time. We love the online version that we have, which enables us to scale it up, which was developed by the Crowdsourced Democracy Group in the School of Engineering here, because it has an automated moderator and it has a neutral administration of the time. You can see a clock running around, and at 45 seconds, people are cut off. And when the faculty had to deliberate on the new school, the Dorr School of Sustainability,
I can imagine.
they loved this mechanism because it shut their colleagues up after 45 seconds. But we find dramatic reductions in affective polarization, in emotional contempt for the other side, ideologically or partisanly, after people deliberate. And so if we could find a way to promote deliberation in communities and schools or bring people together online, I think we could reduce polarization in this country and actually increase information about the issues.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, it leaves a lot of optimism. I do want to say we're going to open up for audience participation in a couple minutes. I will say this room has a lot of GSB students, a lot of future leaders of the world, and other policymakers and community leaders. And I just wanted each of you to maybe just give one piece of advice. If you could advise anything for these future leaders to help create more trustworthy institutions, to create ecosystems that are more trustworthy in terms of information, and build up that shared sense of trust, one thing, what would you advise? I know there's a lot of things, but any advice that you'd have that you hope for them in the future?
Sure.
Tom, you want to start?
Mine would be the most important lesson I've learned as a journalist, and that's what you say when you listen. Because I mean, I was a little Jewish kid from Minnesota who wanted to cover the Arab Muslim world in the 70s. That was not a natural thing. And the New York Times had a rule you couldn't be Jewish and go to Beirut or Jerusalem. And I broke both those bans. But I didn't do it by going out there saying, you're all great, you're all wonderful, it's all the other guy's fault. My secret, I think, to surviving there was to be a good listener. Because two things happen when you listen. One is what you learn when you listen. And all the stories I got wrong were because I was talking when I should have been listening. But the second thing is even more important. It's what you say when you listen. Because listening is a sign of respect. And it's amazing what people will let you say to or about them if they think you respect them. And if they don't think you respect them, you can't tell them the sky is blue and the sun is shining. So what you say when you listen is really the most important thing you can say at all.
I find it so inspiring because we've been hanging out for many years, starting in Washington, D.C., and you'll go and talk to anyone. I mean, you literally will talk to anyone, to listen to anyone. It's not just a listen to the high-powered people.
Everyone's
You're
got something to
really,
teach.
equal opportunity listening. And there's also a deep humility in that as a leadership characteristic. And I think here at the GSB, we really do try to emphasize that. Margaret, any words of wisdom?
Well, I think we've touched on one of the things I would say, which is building new kinds of communities that really interact and listen to each other and have respect and have those capacities. But I thought I would give a concrete example of where trustworthy government was rebuilt, or trust in a particular government institution. And that's in Australia in the 1980s, when Bob Hawke was elected as prime minister. And he inherited a crisis around the tax system, which had become corrupt and was undermined by a whole variety of factors that I won't go into. So how do you rebuild confidence in the tax system? What he did was basically have a constitutional convention around it with lots of different groups represented. It was a form of your kind of American one room. It was Australian one room. And actually the tax system that came out of that wasn't all that different than the tax system before. But people had confidence in it. They'd been part of a process in which they'd engaged, participated, and expressed their views and been listened to.
Wow.
So it's possible.
I love it. These examples are really helpful, and we could do it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, someone else did it, we can do it.
Yep.
Larry?
Well, before I say the one thing, let me say that that was one of the most powerful things I observed in Dallas, Texas, in 2019 when we did the original in-person America in One Room, is the power of creating something new just out of listening. I went to all kinds of small group discussions. 500 people were broken up into small groups of about 12, and people were sometimes in tears at the end because they had listened to one another across incredibly deep divisions.
Yeah.
And if you are able to go to our website, American One Room, there's a 4-minute CNN clip that followed one particular small group that I think is one of the most powerful visualizations I've seen of what you just said. And so my one word would be a bridge. Step outside your comfort zone and bridge, your information flows and social networks with a broader range of input. Be a bridge socially to difference, political difference, social difference. If we can't find a way to bridge our differences in the way you saw on the streets of Minneapolis, Tom, and listen to one another, I don't think we're going to get out of the trust dilemma, and I don't think we're going to get out of the downward spiral of democracy.
Wow. Thanks so much. I want to open it up for discussion. The mic's going around. I want to just mention another thing, Larry, that relates to what you're saying is when leaders do that naturally, when they're bridging, when they're being courageous and they're vulnerable and listening and so forth, they're also role modeling that behavior. They're setting the norms, which have been so shattered, as you talked about earlier, Tom. So I think there's a contagion in showing that and role modeling that also.
They haven't been shattered everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. We're ending optimistic. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. I can't really see much. We need like sunglasses up here, but let's see how back there. And let us know which panelist you think could address your question to.
This was terrific. Thank you so much. I don't know who can answer this question, but one factor that you did not bring up was the increasing economic inequity and concentration of wealth among a small group of people, and I'm wondering how that plays into the topic.
So broadly speaking, inequality as yet another dimension. Anyone want to?
I think any of us could answer it.
Yeah, Margaret?
Go ahead.
It plays a role. And thank you for bringing it up. I mean, and that is happening in many parts of the world where we're seeing reintroduction of a disparity of wealth. And again, if you go back to the statistics that Larry was presenting earlier, I mean, he was emphasizing parliament in those 4 countries where trust in government is fairly high, but there are also countries that are relatively equal, where they have dealt with those inequalities. I mean, they're all countries that have done advanced innovations and technologies and have some very wealthy people, but they get taxed. There's a commitment, even among them, to the collective good, to sharing the wealth to some extent. They might have kicked at the beginning, but they've gotten used to it. And we just don't do, that's why I was saying that one of the issues is really neoliberalism and the end of neoliberalism and what it has wrought. And we haven't really dealt with all those consequences yet of creating this unrestrained, wealthy class going back to the Gilded Age.
Mm-hmm.
I strongly agree with that, and it doesn't take a confiscatory wealth tax, which I'm utterly opposed to, in order to have a truly progressive income tax, which I think is eroded in the United States because of its practical implementation. The other thing is, honestly, I don't know. I'm not an expert. I'm not sure really any human being knows what the AI revolution is going to do to jobs in the US and the world. But if we wipe out a lot of jobs that aren't going to be replaced, and we've got a lot of people sitting out there without job prospects, what you're seeing now in terms of distrust and alienation is nothing compared to what will be coming.
Yeah, that's a really important point because we didn't really have enough time to get into the AI dimension here. It could be something that could be furthering shattering of truth, but also it could be something that can help perhaps rebuild truth. There is a lot of research going on here at Stanford that's looking at how AI can help negotiate conspiracy theories among other institutions and help people understand that they're more similar than they're different. But of course, there's also the dynamics you're talking about both economically and also with misinformation. Any other thing that the panel wants to say about that, about anything on AI?
I have a lot to say about that, but I'm not sure I should start down that route.
Well, just
but
brief.
I do think that, we get over, AI is certainly going to undermine jobs, no question about it. But there are also lots of jobs. The big economy will be the care economy and the health economy. And we ought to start recognizing that, respecting the people who do that work, and respecting them by paying them well and providing the training and support they need. There's also going to be conservation that needs to be done. We're having problems with, Maxine who I think is still here, was emphasizing in the last panel how we're losing all kinds of biodiversity. You were emphasizing it in your opening remarks. There are jobs that are connected with that in rebuilding that environment and rebuilding that diversity. So, I think we can use the AI destruction of certain kinds of jobs to build a capacity to do some of the work that really needs to be done to rebuild our earth, to rebuild our social infrastructure, and to take care of all those people who are going to need care into the future.
And maybe we need that big conference like in Australia to try to coordinate this ahead of time. We're just allowing this to emerge without any kind of accountability for these systems. Tom, any thoughts from you before we see if there's any other questions from the audience?
There was a question over here.
Just on that subject, you can't inherently trust AI. The models today, right? So you already have, on the subject of trust, you can't trust this model, the models that are generating this information, code or whatever. And so that is going to present a problem because a lot of times we just see a number on a screen and go, we'll accept it. And you really can't. And that's going to get better, but it's not going to be absolute.
Yeah, and it might be contextual. Some people, I see that there's a lot of people that use AI for various purposes, including for therapy, for connection. There's a recent paper that just came out here at Stanford showing how sycophantic AI is, and people actually feel respected by AI in ways that is remarkable in such case where it's escalating their conflicts with other people. So that's also, I think it's also very nuanced. Anything else, Tom, you wanted to mention? Any final words? I know we're almost out of time, and apologies. We'd love to be locking everyone in this room for a couple other hours, but we have to march on to the next event. But any final thoughts?
I'm just, when it comes to AI, I'm completely humbled by this moment, the way I think about this, and I've written about it with my tech tutor, Craig Mundy, is that I think the simplest way to think about this moment is to divide the history of the world up into 3 phase changes. And phase changes are a very useful physics way of thinking about the world because phase 1 is from, and we use we treat humans as H2O molecules and technology as heat. So the first phase of human history is from the dawn of man to the printing press. We call it the age of ice or the age of tools, because H2O molecules and ice move very slowly and they're very separated. That's what makes ice ice. Technology comes, the printing press melts the ice, ushers in the age of water. Now ideas flow, people flow, capital flows, trade flows. We call it the age of information and the age of water. 2017, transformer algorithm, more heat, it boils the water into vapor. And we bring in the age of intelligence or the age of vapor. You think of AI as a vapor, I think is very useful because AI is actually going to go into everything, unlike any other technology. Your watch, your hip replacement, your car, your toaster, your refrigerator. And when people ask Craig and me what time it is, we don't actually give them an hour, we give them a temperature. We say the time today is 211.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, we're 1/10 of 1 degree from a phase change from water to vapor. And the reason phase changes are useful as a metaphor is that they're nonlinear. That is, when you're an H2O molecule as ice, you have no idea what it's like to be water. And when you're water, you have no idea what it's like to be steam. And we have no idea what is coming when we hit 212 degrees Fahrenheit.
Ooh, I think we'll end it on that note. Please help me thank the panelists. We covered a lot of ground today. Some of this was quite sobering, but the good news I think that we heard from the panelists, trust can be rebuilt. And I think we come up with a lot of good ideas, and I really hope that we'll continue the conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes, again.
Good job.